November 18th, 1993. Sony Music Studios, New York City. Bob Dylan was recording what would become his World Gone Wrong album, diving deep into traditional folk songs that contain truths transcending their original context. At 52, Dylan had already revolutionized popular music twice, first with folk protest songs, then by going electric and creating an entirely new form of rock poetry. Tonight he was working late, perfecting interpretations of songs like Blood in My Eyes and Broke Down Engine. The studio was nearly empty except for his core team and session musicians who understood his working style. Around midnight, his producer mentioned that Kurt Cobain was down the hall, working on acoustic demos. MTV Unplugged had aired a few weeks earlier, and Kurt was exploring whether that stripped-down approach might influence Nirvana's future direction. Nirvana, Dylan said. The Loud Kids. Dylan had heard of them, but dismissed them as part of the noise that passed for music among young people. He'd seen musical revolutions before. Most forgot that revolution required something worth revolting toward, not just against. What's he doing here this late? Dylan asked. Same thing you are, working on songs. Dylan's curiosity was piqued despite himself. He'd always been interested in other songwriters' processes, even when he disagreed with their results. Mind if I go say hello? The hallway between studios was dimly lit, institutional in that way recording facilities often were. Dylan could hear guitar through the door of Studio B, acoustic and careful, someone working through chord progressions with the patience of someone who understood that songs revealed themselves gradually. He knocked and entered without waiting. Kurt Cobain sat alone with a battered acoustic guitar, a notebook beside him covered in crossed-out lyrics. He wore a green cardigan over a Pixies t-shirt, blonde hair hanging in his face as he concentrated on finger-picking patterns, more complex than anything Dylan associated with grunge. Kurt looked up as Dylan entered, his eyes widening slightly in recognition. Mr. Dylan, Kurt said quietly, setting his guitar aside and starting to stand. Stay seated, Dylan said, gesturing toward a chair. Don't mind if I listen for a minute, do you? Kurt shook his head, though he looked nervous about the prospect of performing for one of his heroes. Dylan sat down and studied Kurt with the kind of intense attention he usually reserved for examining vintage guitars or rare manuscripts. So you're the Nirvana fellow, the one who's supposedly speaking for a generation? There was something in Dylan's tone that wasn't quite dismissive, but wasn't encouraging either. A subtle challenge, the kind that suggested he was measuring Kurt against standards the younger musician might not understand. I guess some people see it that way, Kurt replied carefully. Interesting choice of words. Some people. Dylan leaned back in his chair. I actually started a folk revolution when I was about your age. Wrote songs that changed how people thought about music's relationship to social change. Then I went electric, shocked everyone, but I kept writing songs that pushed boundaries. The silence stretched between them, loaded with unspoken questions about where this conversation was heading. So tell me, Dylan said finally, what revolution are you starting? What boundaries are you pushing besides just being loud? It was a direct challenge, delivered with the kind of intellectual arrogance that Dylan had perfected over decades of interviews with journalists who tried to pin down his artistic intentions. Kurt picked up his guitar again, not in a defensive way, but as if he needed something familiar to hold on to during what was clearly becoming an uncomfortable conversation. I don't know if I'm starting a revolution, Kurt said honestly. I'm just trying to write songs that feel honest about what it's like to be alive right now. Dylan raised an eyebrow. Honest about what, exactly? What's so unique about your generation's experience that requires a whole new form of musical expression? Kurt considered the question seriously, his fingers unconsciously finding chord shapes on the guitar neck. Growing up knowing the world might end. Growing up with everyone lying to you about everything important. Growing up feeling like you don't belong anywhere, even in your own life. Every generation thinks the world might end, Dylan replied. Every generation discovers that adults lie. Every generation feels alienated. What makes yours special? Kurt's jaw tightened slightly, but not with anger, with something closer to sadness. Maybe nothing makes us special. Maybe that's the point. Explain. Kurt positioned the guitar and started playing something Dylan had never heard before. The chord progression was sophisticated in its simplicity, built on open tunings that created a hypnotic effect. His fingerpicking showed influences that surprised Dylan: folk traditions, blues patterns, even traditional music Dylan himself studied. When Kurt started singing, his voice was soft, vulnerable, carrying impossible weight for someone so young. The lyrics spoke about disconnection, but not self-pityingly. Instead, they acknowledged disconnection as universal, something that connected people rather than isolated them. Kurt sang about feeling like an outsider, but recognizing that almost everyone felt like outsiders. About the strange comfort of shared alienation. About finding beauty in the midst of emotional chaos. Not by resolving the chaos, but by accepting it as part of the human experience. The song lasted maybe 4 minutes, but it felt both longer and shorter than that. Longer because every line seemed to contain multiple layers of meaning. Shorter because Dylan found himself wanting it to continue, to see where Kurt would take these ideas. When Kurt finished, he set the guitar down and looked at Dylan expectantly, as if waiting for judgment. Dylan sat in silence for several seconds, processing what he'd just heard. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Dylan asked finally. "Like what?" "Like someone who understands that the guitar is a tool for thinking, not just making noise." Kurt looked confused. "I've been playing since I was a kid. Started with punk rock, but I always listened to everything. Folk, blues, country, your stuff. Tried to figure out how songs work, not just how to play them loud." Dylan leaned forward. "That song you just played, I've never heard it before. I wrote it last week. Still working on it. What's it about?" Kurt considered the question. "It's about realizing that feeling like you don't fit anywhere is actually a way of fitting everywhere. That the thing that makes you feel isolated is the same thing that connects you to other people who feel isolated." Dylan nodded slowly. "That's not a new idea. Folk music has always been about that kind of connection. But the way you just expressed it," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "that was something I hadn't heard before." Kurt picked up his guitar again, cradling it like something that might provide comfort. "I grew up listening to your music. Like a rolling stone, changed how I thought about what songs could do. Not just the melody or the words, but the attitude. The way you made it okay to be angry and sad and hopeful all at the same time." Dylan was surprised by the reference. "You understand that song?" "I think so. It's about losing everything you thought you wanted and discovering that maybe that's not the worst thing that could happen to you. About finding out who you are when you don't have anything to hide behind." Dylan sat back, genuinely impressed. Most people, including music critics, completely misunderstood that song. They heard the anger but missed the liberation underneath it. "Can I ask you something?" Dylan said. Kurt nodded. "Do you think your generation is actually different from previous ones? Or do you just have different ways of expressing the same basic human problems?" Kurt thought about this for a long time before answering. "I think every generation has to figure out how to be human under their own specific circumstances. The problems are the same, but the context changes everything. We grew up with nuclear weapons and environmental destruction, and the feeling that all the adults in charge were fundamentally dishonest about everything important. So our music sounds different because our version of those eternal problems feels different." Dylan nodded. "And the loud music? The distortion and volume that everyone associates with your generation? Sometimes pain is quiet," Kurt said. "Sometimes it's loud. Sometimes you need volume to cut through all the noise that's trying to keep you from hearing the truth." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both musicians recognizing something in the other that transcended generational differences. "That song you played," Dylan said eventually, "you should record it. Not with the full band, not with all the volume and effects. Just like you played it tonight." "You think?" "I think if you can write songs like that, you're not just part of a movement or a generation. You're a songwriter, and that's something that lasts beyond trends." Kurt looked down at his guitar. "Thank you. That means more than you probably know." Dylan stood up to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I was wrong about something earlier. I said I started a folk revolution, but revolution isn't something one person starts. It's something that happens when enough people realize they need to express truths that the existing forms can't contain. You're part of that tradition, whether you know it or not. After Dylan left, Kurt sat alone in the studio for another hour, working on the song he'd played. He refined the finger-picking pattern, adjusted some of the lyrics, thought about Dylan's suggestion that he recorded acoustically. That song became You Know You're Right, though Kurt would continue revising it until his death. It was one of the last songs he completed, and many who heard early versions recognized elements that seemed influenced by traditional folk structures, even though it was unmistakably a Nirvana composition. Dylan never publicly discussed that late-night encounter in detail, but people close to him noticed changes in how he talked about contemporary music. He stopped dismissing grunge as mindless noise. He started listening to Nirvana albums, trying to understand how Kurt constructed his songs beneath all the volume and distortion. In his private conversations with other musicians, Dylan began referring to Kurt as the kid who understood something important about carrying tradition forward instead of just throwing it away. He would tell people that Kurt had shown him how the same essential human struggles could be expressed through completely different musical vocabularies without losing their truth or power. Musicians who knew both artists began to notice subtle influences flowing in both directions. Kurt's final recordings showed increased interest in traditional song structures. Dylan's later work incorporated some of the emotional directness that had characterized grunge at its best. When Kurt died on April 5, 1994, Dylan was deeply affected. He had met Kurt only once, but something about that conversation had stayed with him. In his journal that day, Dylan wrote, "The kid understood that folk music isn't about preserving the past. It's about using whatever tools you have to tell the truth about being alive right now." 3 months later, in a Rolling Stone interview about contemporary music, Dylan said something that shocked his fans. "There was this kid, Kurt Cobain, who understood something about songwriting most people miss. He understood that you can use any musical form to get at the same essential human truths. He was carrying on a tradition he probably didn't even know he was part of." In 1997, Dylan released Time Out of Mind, containing musical elements that seemed influenced by alternative rock, not copying the style but incorporating its emotional directness. The story became part of music folklore among those who understood both artists' work. How Bob Dylan challenged Kurt Cobain about his generation's revolution, how Kurt responded by showing Dylan that revolution isn't about starting something new. It's about continuing something eternal with whatever tools your time provides. It was a reminder that the greatest artists don't compete with their predecessors. They continue conversations that have been going on for centuries, adding their own voice to an ongoing dialogue about what it means to be human. The encounter proved that musical greatness recognizes itself across all boundaries: generational, stylistic, cultural. When two authentic voices meet, they don't argue about whose approach is correct. They listen, learn, and carry forward whatever truth they've discovered together. The conversation lasted less than an hour, but its influence can be heard in both artists' later work. Dylan learned that innovation could honor tradition. Kurt learned that his instincts about connecting with something larger than his generation were correct. Both discovered that the folk tradition is broader than anyone realizes. It's not about the instruments you use or volume you choose, but about willingness to transform personal pain into shared understanding. That night in Sony Music Studios, two masters of American songwriting found common ground in the space between their different approaches to the same eternal questions. Dylan, the revolutionary who had already changed music twice, learned that revolution is ongoing, not historical. Kurt, the reluctant voice of his generation, learned that his intuition about music's deeper purposes was part of a tradition stretching back through centuries. The studio that night was where past and present met, where the folk tradition revealed itself as something living and evolving, where two very different voices discovered they were singing about the same fundamental human experiences. It was a conversation that lasted an hour but echoed through both men's music for the rest of their careers, proving that the best art builds bridges across seemingly impossible gaps.